Welcome to the mysterious casebook. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a teacake hides a folded note and a dreadful secret. As Miss Marple listens, every crumb may speak of guilt. Are you ready to uncover what the village whispers dare not tell? Light a candle and let the mystery begin. The air above St. Mary Mead that Tuesday morning was as clear as pressed glass, and for a time it seemed that nothing could disturb its fragile brightness. The postmistress was setting tulips in a jug behind the counter. The milkman whistled tunelessly as he rattled through his route, and in the vicarage garden, bees labored among the primroses with the single-minded serenity only insects and clergymen's wives seemed to possess. At the Bluebell Bakery, however, serenity had always been a more perishable commodity. Its small bell jangled with a nervous eagerness each time someone entered, and on this particular morning, that bell announced more than the usual trickle of gossip. Mrs. Edgecombe, the baker's wife, was rearranging a tray of tea cakes, each still faintly steaming, their tops glazed to the color of church brass. She was a woman of formidable roundness of bosom, of opinion, and of curiosity, and she hummed under her breath as though warding off boredom. The hum faltered when she saw Mrs. Price Ridley approach, wearing the determined expression of a woman who disapproves of yeast on principle. "I trust your husband isn't using margarine again," Mrs. Price Ridley began, leaning conspiratorially across the counter. "It has a taste of industry about it." Mrs. Edgecombe's smile twitched. "Butter, dear. Always butter. And what'll it be, plain or currant?" "Plain. I have never believed in fruit in bread." Behind her, the doorbell chimed again, and a soft, polite voice asked for 2 Bath buns and a half loaf. It was Miss Marple, dressed neatly in dove grey, her gloved hands folded round her basket. She murmured something pleasant, her eyes drifting across the counter with the tranquil interest of a cat at a bird table. It was then that Mrs. Edgecombe noticed the thing which would, in time, be repeated at least 27 times in conversation. One of the tea cakes, perfectly baked, golden and innocent, had a corner slightly lifted, as though prized up by some unseen hand. "Careless of me," she said, pressing it down again. But Miss Marple's gaze lingered. "A curious crease," she observed mildly. "It looks rather as though something was folded inside." Mrs. Edgecombe laughed, though not entirely comfortably. "Oh, we'd never hide anything in a tea cake, Miss Marple. Not unless it were a wedding ring." The old lady's eyes warmed. "You'd be surprised, my dear, at the number of secrets that find their way into food. I once knew a cook who kept her confessions in pie crust." Mrs. Price Ridley made a small sniffing sound that might have meant disbelief or perhaps disapproval of levity before noon. She turned, her bag swinging like a pendulum of judgment. "Really, one does tire of these country jokes." A silence followed her departure, during which the bell jingled faintly, as though exhaling. Mrs. Edgecombe returned to her tray, nudging the offending tea cake back into alignment. But when Miss Marple reached for her buns, she paused. "Strange," she said softly, "how paper can behave like pastry when folded thin enough." Mrs. Edgecombe blinked. "Paper, Miss Marple." "Oh, nothing at all, my dear. I only thought I saw a crease that reminded me of a note." Outside, the church clock struck 11, a sound that always made the street seem momentarily self-conscious. Miss Marple stepped into the sunlight, the scent of yeast and vanilla trailing after her, and continued toward the high street, her mind already moving with quiet precision, like a sewing needle tracing an invisible seam. By midday, the rumor of the note in the tea cake had fluttered across the village with the speed of a flock startled from a field. Mrs. Hartnell told the butcher it was a love letter baked in by accident. The butcher's boy declared it was a blackmail threat. By the time it reached the vicarage, it had become an anonymous confession to a crime. When Mrs. Edgecombe finally dared to unwrap the tea cake herself, curiosity having defeated decorum, she found flattened by butter and sugar a small scrap of paper, no larger than a postage stamp. The writing was blurred but legible. "I cannot live with it any longer." That discovery might have remained a private curiosity had not her husband, returning from his deliveries, gone pale upon hearing it. He sank into a chair beside the oven, muttering something about bad luck and the wrong batch, words which only fanned the flames of speculation once Mrs. Edgecombe, flustered and indignant, repeated them to her sister-in-law over the phone. By the hour of evensong, St. Mary Mead had divided itself neatly into camps, those who believed the note was a prank, and those who were certain it was a confession. Neither camp was willing to let facts interfere. At the vicarage gate, Miss Marple paused to greet young Mr. Hawthorne, the curate, who was anxiously rearranging hymn sheets. "A busy day, I gather," she said, with that mildness which always seemed to invite confidence. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's absurd," he exclaimed, "all this fuss over a scrap of paper, but Mrs. Edgecombe insists it came from nowhere. She's even sworn the dough was mixed clean." "Cleanliness," Miss Marple replied, "is sometimes the best way of removing evidence." He looked at her in bewilderment. "Evidence?" She smiled. "Oh, just an old woman's fancy, though I do sometimes think that where there is pastry, there is always a story." As she walked away, the sunlight slipped behind a cloud. The air changed subtly, like a clock hesitating between ticks. Somewhere far off, a door slammed sharp and final. The piece of St. Mary Mead had tilted, imperceptibly but decisively, from its delicate balance. By the time the church clock tolled 3, the mystery of the tea-cake had spread farther than the scent of cinnamon that morning. In St. Mary Mead, news did not travel so much as settle like flour dust on a counterfine, persistent and impossible to sweep away. It floated through parlors and across garden fences, reshaping itself with each retelling until it bore only a polite resemblance to the truth. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement was pouring tea for Miss Marple and Mrs. Price Ridley, who had arrived with the righteousness of one forced to bear the ignorance of others. Her hat quivered slightly as she spoke. "I merely said that if people must sell baked goods to the public, they might at least ensure no scandal is folded into the dough. One cannot be too careful about moral hygiene." Mrs. Clement smiled, her patience a hymn. "Perhaps it was only an accident, dear. A scrap from an old recipe, maybe." "The recipe paper doesn't say, 'I cannot live with it any longer,'" snapped Mrs. Price Ridley. "It's either a confession or the start of a novel, and I, for one, prefer my novels unbaked." Miss Marple stirred her tea with deliberate gentleness. "Strange how tragedy often hides among domestic comforts," she said. "People imagine the worst horrors come with thunderclaps, but I've known them to arrive between the jam and the cream." Mrs. Clement's eyes softened. "You think it's serious, then?" "Oh, my dear, I never think, at least not aloud," Miss Marple replied mildly. "But I do observe. For instance, the Edgecombe's apprentice boy looked quite white about the gills when I saw him near the bakery door. He carried a basket that rattled oddly for one full of bread." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "That boy is always pale, and lazy, and insolent." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, "and yet the insolent often blush when others lie." Outside, the afternoon sunlight slanted across the lane, where Mrs. Hartnell and Miss Weatherby stood by the grocer's window in postures that pretended coincidence. From there, the conversation travelled on invisible wires. The paper had been written by Mrs. Edgecombe herself. No, by her husband, out of guilt, by the baker's cousin, who had vanished from Bristol years ago. A single phrase, repeated with conviction and embroidery, can furnish a dozen crimes before supper. By 5 o'clock, Inspector Crail from Much Benham had been summoned. He was a square man of modest height, his voice the sort that made statements sound like verdicts. When he entered the bakery, he removed his hat as though addressing a congregation. "We'd best see the article, Mrs. Edgecombe." She produced the offending tea-cake, now half unwrapped and surrounded by the same awe that attends relics. "It's true, Inspector. It came out just like that, folded up in the middle. plain as you please. Crail examined it with tweezers, then flattened the scrap on a napkin. Inks fresh, blue-black. Writing slanted upward. Nervous hand, possibly female. His satisfaction was that of a man who'd once been told he had no intuition and had spent a decade proving otherwise. Mr. Edgecombe shifted by the oven, wiping his hands on a towel that already looked surrendered to despair. "We didn't put it there. I swear by my license, Inspector, that batch was clean." Miss Marple, who had quietly entered behind a small delegation of interested ladies, spoke almost to herself. A clean batch, yes. But there are kinds of cleanliness that remove more than dirt. Crail glanced at her, respectful but wary. "Evening, Miss Marple. Always a pleasure to have your counsel." "Oh, I never give counsel," she said with that guileless smile. "I simply notice that when people fear scandal, they tidy rather too quickly." Mrs. Edgecombe flushed. "You think we hid something?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that one sometimes sweeps a confession away with the crumbs, only to find it returns beneath the cloth." The inspector folded the note and pocketed it. "We'll have it tested. Inks can tell tales. So can handwriting." From the corner, the apprentice, young Billy, made a faint sound, somewhere between a cough and a sigh. Crail's eyes flicked to him. "You were on duty this morning?" "Yes, sir." "Mixed the first lot of dough. And did you notice anyone near the counter before it went in the oven?" Billy hesitated. "Just Mr. Edgecombe, sir. Said he'd forgotten to check the yeast." Mrs. Edgecombe's head turned sharply. "He what? I never." She stopped herself, but the tremor in her voice lingered. Miss Marple observed her with the look of someone listening to a piece of music they have heard before. When the inspector departed, promising discretion, the shop's warmth felt suddenly oppressive. Mrs. Edgecombe began rearranging her tins again, though none were out of order. Miss Marple reached out and straightened one gently. "Sometimes," she said, "it is easier to face what is inside than to keep polishing the outside." Outside, the street had cooled into twilight. Curtains glowed with lamplight. Teapots clinking the rhythm of domestic peace resumed its patient march. Yet beneath that familiar cadence, the village trembled with excitement, the sort that can only exist when danger seems both near and deliciously distant. Miss Marple, walking home through the fading light, paused by the hedge of the old vicarage and considered the faint gleam of a window where no lamp had been lit in years. The house had been empty since the old organist's death last winter, and yet she could have sworn she saw movement no more than a shadow crossing pale lace. Perhaps it was imagination. Or perhaps, like the note in the teacake, it was the smallest beginning of something dreadful. She continued down the lane, the sound of her shoes barely disturbing the hush. In her mind, the pieces had already begun to take their quiet places, not answers, but possibilities. The note's phrase echoed softly. "I cannot live with it any longer." The words might belong to despair, or to guilt. The difference, she thought, was usually one of intention. Behind her, the church bell marked the half-hour. It sounded different now, just slightly, as though struck by a hesitant hand. Miss Marple listened until it faded. Some small, invisible shift had occurred in St. Mary Mead, and she could feel it in the stillness, the kind of stillness that exists only between the question and its first fateful answer. The next morning dawned with that particular kind of brightness that makes people uneasy when gossip has been lively the night before. St. Mary Mead seemed to stand straighter, as though trying to appear respectable under inspection. Curtains twitched, milk bottles gleamed, and every doorstep looked recently swept as if cleanliness might banish suspicion. Inspector Crail arrived at the vicarage at 9 sharp, his boots glistening and his expression already sharpened by purpose. He was the sort of man who believed that mystery dissolved neatly under daylight, though St. Mary Mead was never so obliging. Miss Marple, invited at Mrs. Clement's gentle insistence, sat quietly with her knitting bag beside her, her demeanor as calm as the ticking clock on the mantel. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Crail said, consulting his notebook. "You were present when the note was discovered. I would like your impression of the matter." "My impression," she said softly, "is that tea cakes are seldom the medium for public confession, unless, of course, the message was not intended to be found at all." The inspector raised a brow. "Not intended." She inclined her head. A note hidden in something to be sold might have been placed there in haste, perhaps to be retrieved later, or to conceal it from someone close at hand. We mustn't assume its discovery was the plan. Crail made a non-committal grunt. "You're thinking of a motive." "I'm thinking of fear," Miss Marple replied. "Motivation usually begins there." Mrs. Clement poured tea, trying to disguise her fascination. "The poor Edgecombes must be in dreadful distress. People are saying all sorts of things." Crail's mouth twitched. "Indeed they are, and most of them are nonsense. Still, Mr. Edgecomb's remark about the wrong batch interests me." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "He may have meant the wrong sort of customer, Inspector. Sometimes the thing that leaves the shop is not what causes alarm, but who receives it." Before Crail could pursue that thought, the vicar's maid appeared in the doorway. "Beg pardon, sir, but Mr. Edgecombe's outside. Says he'll only speak to you." The baker entered, hat in hand, his face pale as dough. "Inspector, I've remembered something," he said. "It's about the flour delivery." Crail gestured to him to sit. "Go on." "It came a day late this week. A new man on the lorry. Said the mill was short-handed. I had never seen him before, but when I opened the sacks, there was one that wasn't ours. Smaller make. Foreign writing on the label." "Did you use it?" asked Crail. "I did. Couldn't waste the morning. Mix it with the rest." Miss Marple looked up briefly. "Foreign flour, you say? That's unusual. And what became of the sack?" Mr. Edgecombe frowned. "I burned it. I didn't like the look of the print. Seemed foreign Hungarian or something." Crail scribbled. "No doubt coincidence. But we'll check. Anything else?" The baker hesitated, glancing toward Miss Marple as though weighing her kindness. "Only that my apprentice Billy was late that morning. Said his bicycle chain broke, but the chain looked clean to me." After the man left, Crail closed his notebook with a snap. A clumsy liar, perhaps, but not a murderer. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, Inspector, you'll find that clumsy liars are often honest souls attempting dishonesty for the first time. It's the smooth ones who require closer attention." Her words hung in the air, quiet as dust motes turning in the sunlight. Crail pocketed his notes, muttering something about handwriting analysis, and took his leave. The vicar's maid, hovering near the door, whispered to Mrs. Clement that Mrs. Edgecombe had fainted while icing buns. Within an hour, half the village would hear she'd been arrested. As the door closed behind the inspector, Miss Marple's expression grew distant. "It is remarkable," she murmured, "how trouble spreads in the same direction as good butter, outward and downward. Once it's soaked in, nothing can quite remove the stain." Mrs. Clement looked troubled. "Do you think it's as bad as all that?" Miss Marple's gaze rested on the teacup's delicate crack, almost invisible in the glaze. "When something breaks quietly, dear, it's usually already been weak for a long time." Outside, the morning seemed deceptively peaceful. Sparrows argued in the hedges, and a cart rattled toward the green. Yet beneath that fragile order, something had begun to shift, a hidden current, carrying guilt or pity, or both, toward whatever reckoning lay ahead. The stillness after the inspector's departure did not last. By midday, the village had acquired its first official suspect, young Billy, the baker's apprentice, whose lateness and trembling manner had made him the ideal target for speculation. He had that unfortunate combination of youth and poverty that invited suspicion without much effort. By 2 o'clock, Mrs. Price Ridley was confidently declaring to anyone within earshot that the boy had been caught tampering with the yeast and that the note was his confession of some terrible act. Miss Marple, walking home from the vicarage, heard snippets of this story carried on the wind like scraps of paper, themselves reshaped, embroidered, and darkened in each retelling. The lanes were alive with a nervous chatter that disguised excitement as concern. She paused at the gate of the bakery, watching as Billy swept flour from the step in clumsy arcs. His movements were too hurried, too deliberate, the motions of someone trying to appear useful under watchful eyes. "Good afternoon, Billy," she said gently. "Hard at work, I see." He straightened, color flooding his cheeks. "Afternoon, miss. Just keeping things tidy." "Tidiness is very admirable," she said, "though it can sometimes make people think one has something to hide." He froze, then gave a quick, nervous laugh. "Nothing to hide, Miss Marple, only flour." She smiled kindly. "Flour conceals more than it reveals, I often think. I once knew a housemaid who hid her heartbreak in the dust. She was very thorough until she wasn't." Billy's broom faltered. "People like to talk," he muttered. "They say things that aren't true." "Oh, they do indeed," she agreed. "But they seldom invent without reason. I wonder, what reason might someone have to place such a note in a tea cake?" He looked away. "I don't know, miss." "Perhaps not," she said. "But you might know who'd have the opportunity. The one who shapes the dough has a kind of authorship, don't you think?" Before he could answer, the bell above the door jingled and Mrs. Edgecombe appeared, her expression tight with the effort of composure. "Miss Marple, how very kind of you to call. I do wish people would leave us in peace. The inspector has nearly ruined our trade." "I dare say that's temporary," Miss Marple replied. Suspicion fades more quickly than gossip, though rarely as completely. Mrs. Edgecombe's hands twisted her apron. "My husband says we've nothing to fear, but I know better. This sort of thing stains a name. And that boy," she broke off, glancing toward Billy with irritation. "He's been restless all morning, couldn't look me in the eye." "Perhaps he feels the eyes of others upon him," said Miss Marple softly. "They can be quite heavy when one's young." Mrs. Edgecombe hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Between ourselves, Miss Marple, I think he's mixed up in something. There was a letter that came for him last week, foreign stamp. He snatched it as quickly as lightning before I could see the name." "That must have piqued your curiosity," Miss Marple said mildly. "I have a business to run," Mrs. Edgecombe replied defensively. "Can't have secrets under my roof." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "but secrets have such a way of slipping through keyholes. They don't like confinement." Mrs. Edgecombe's lips pressed together. "He's been distant since. I only hope he hasn't brought shame on us." When Miss Marple left the bakery, she saw Inspector Crail crossing the green toward the shop, his stride purposeful, his notebook ready. She paused near the vicarage gate, knitting bag dangling from her arm, and watched as he entered. Through the glass, she could see the brief, unmistakable tableau, the boy's frightened stance, the inspector's measured questioning, the baker's wife hovering like a storm about to break. The scene was ordinary, even domestic, yet Miss Marple felt the faintest chill, the kind that comes not from guilt but from misunderstanding. Later, she found herself seated once again in the vicarage drawing-room, tea cooling in its cup. Mrs. Clement sighed. Such a pity about the boy. He was kind to the children at Sunday school. "Pity," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Yes, pity is often the beginning of error." "You think he's innocent?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that innocence and guilt are sometimes like flour and icing, easily confused until one tastes them." Outside, the first clouds of evening gathered, soft as smoke. The day's brightness dimmed, and with it, the confidence of the village. Windows glowed, doors closed earlier than usual, and somewhere a dog barked uneasily into the darkening air. Miss Marple rose, fastening her shawl. "We mustn't rush to judgment," she said. "In my experience, the truth often waits until everyone's quite certain of the wrong person." As she stepped out into the lane, she noticed a scrap of paper caught in the hedge, not the mysterious note, but a torn envelope fragment, faintly smudged with flour. She turned it over in the fading light. The stamp was foreign, indeed Hungarian, just as Mr. Edgecombe had said. She slipped it into her reticule, her expression unreadable. The evening breeze stirred the hedgerow, whispering like someone repeating a secret too often. In the distance, the bakery lights went out all at once. Shop windows along the high street glimmered, yet the bakery's panes fell suddenly to black, as if a hand had laid a cloth over a cage. Miss Marple, who disliked abrupt darkness on principle, paused at the corner and listened. The bell above the bakery door did not sound. No voices drifted out. Only the small, fretful clink of cooling tins answered the evening air. She crossed to the side passage, where flour dust always made a pale moon path underfoot. The back door stood on the latch. From within came the particular scent of things recently burned, twine, perhaps, or paper sharp, papery, with a whisper of sweetness. Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly against the wood. "Mrs. Edgecombe?" She was pleasant and ordinary. "Have you run short of candles?" A shape moved Mr. Edgecombe, shoulders stooped, a towel thrown over one arm like a resigned waiter. "Fuse," he said shortly. "Went all at once. I've sent Billy to fetch Mr. Spragg from the ironmongery." "Inconvenient," Miss Marple murmured. "Though blackouts have a way of simplifying matters. One sees only what continues to shine." He gave a strained laugh that was not quite laughter. "We're closing early. Nothing to see." On the contrary, there was a good deal to see when one ceased to be told there was nothing. Miss Marple stepped into the warmth. In the dimness, the oven mouth glowed like a banked hearth. Trays stood in orderly ranks. The great mixing bowl, half cleaned, leaned on its side like a hollow moon. On the bench lay a pile of waxed rounds for lining buns, neat as altar wafers, except that the uppermost showed a faint crescent tear, as though a smaller circle had been cut from it with a bottle top or a thimble. "Those are pretty," Miss Marple said absently. "One admires tidy circles." Mr. Edgecombe's eyes followed hers before he remembered not to. "Old stock. Too large. Wasteful, my wife says." "Ah," Miss Marple said. "Waste is only untidiness's cousin. A thrifty woman will amend the shape to suit the need." He flinched almost imperceptibly. Her attention drifted to the ash bin by the back step. The lid was warmly just. She lifted it with the mild curiosity of a sparrow at a crumb. Ash, grey and blameless, a sour scrap of twine, and under it, a sliver of paper no bigger than a thumbnail, curled with heat, its surface wax-sheened. She touched it, faint blue-black bled through, reversed as if pressed against glass. Not letters, but their ghost, a mirror whisper of ink. "How fortunate," she observed gently, "that wax keeps a secret soft even in the oven." Mr. Edgecombe swallowed. "I can't have people poking in our rubbish." "Oh, no," said Miss Marple. "Rubbish is the most private thing in the world. It is simply that it talks so very readily." Footsteps sounded in the passage. Mrs. Edgecombe appeared with a candle, flame casting her features into a civility of light and shadow. "We're closed," she said. Then, seeing Miss Marple, softened a fraction. "It's only till the fuse is mended. We'll open in the morning." "Quite right," Miss Marple agreed. "Morning is where people prefer their alibis. May I trouble you for a small question? These wafer papers, have you long used this brand?" Mrs. Edgecombe's glance flickered. "Since last month." "Cheaper. Keeps the bottoms from sticking." "Indeed, and very practical to cut a small circle if one wished to keep something from touching dough." She smiled faintly. "Ink, for instance, tends to run. Butter persuades it to confess." Silence owned the room for a breath. Mr. Edgecombe turned away, busying himself with the pointless smoothing of an already smooth cloth. "We've nothing to do with notes," he muttered. "It's all got out of hand." "Everything gets out of hand," said Miss Marple amiably, "before anyone admits it was in the hand at all." From the street, a pair of voices approached Mr. Spragg's cheerful burr and Billy's younger, thinner echo. Mrs. Edgecombe moved quickly to the door, then halted as Inspector Crail filled the threshold beside them, authority like a draught that cooled the flower-dust air. "Evening," he said. "Fuse trouble? Convenient time for tidying. Might I step in?" "Only a blown wire," Mrs. Edgecombe answered, tight-lipped. Crail's eye went to the ash bin, then the bench, then briefly to Miss Marple. "You do get everywhere at the useful moments," he said dryly. "Only where tea and truth are likely," she returned. "Tonight, I fear the latter is in shorter supply." Crail nodded to Spragg, who crouched by the fuse box with a small grunt of contentment. Wires clicked, metal chattered. Light sprang up with a clean, unmerciful brightness. Under it, certain details suddenly became articulate. A thin smear of butter on the edge of a cutter, too small for buns, a shallow dent on the bench where something coincided had been pressed, a damp ring where a bottle had stood, its base flecked with ink. "Billy," Crail said without turning. "Where's that bottle?" The boy started. "What bottle, sir?" "The one that sat here and was moved in a hurry." Billy's glance flitted to the shelf, then to Mrs. Edgecombe. "I washed it, sir. It had spilt ink." Miss Marple's eyes were very kind. "Accidents do happen. What interests me is which accidents are repeated. People practice their lies, as musicians practice scales, clumsy at first, then polished." Crail picked up the butter-smeared cutter. "This isn't for buns." "Tea cakes," Mrs. Edgecombe said quickly. "Small ones for children's boxes." "We tried them once." "And lined with wax," Crail added, "so a thing placed in the center wouldn't bleed into dough." He set the cutter down. "Which of you baked that batch?" The silence was not equal. Mr. Edgecombe's face had the dullness of someone who has already confessed to himself. Billy looked like a boy who had not yet learned what confession was. Mrs. Edgecombe held the candle, though the light was no longer needed, and the flame quivered minutely. Miss Marple's voice arrived like a folding cloth, gentle but decisive. "You will find, Inspector, that whoever placed the note took very great care not to damage it. That argues intention, not impulse. And intention is a habit. It shows itself elsewhere, perhaps in a letter posted last week, perhaps in a purchase that doesn't fit the household purse." Crail pocketed the cutter. "We'll see which purse is light." He looked not unkindly at the boy. "And which hands have ink ground into them." Billy's hands were clean, too clean, so raw at the knuckles. Mrs. Edgecombe's were red from scouring Mr. Edgecombe's bore, the honest engravings of flour and heat. Miss Marple, watching, thought how respectable guilt often dresses itself in tidiness, while innocence remains carelessly smudged. Spragg straightened with satisfaction there. The lights held. Outside, evening deepened, and in the reflection of the window, Miss Marple caught a pale movement at the far side of the lane upstairs in the empty old vicarage, a flutter of lace as if a curtain had been set back by a hand that preferred not to be seen. The faint flutter behind the lace hung in Miss Marple's thoughts as she walked home through the settling dusk. Lamps glowed from parlor windows, their reflections wavering on the damp pavements like ghosts rehearsing gestures. Somewhere, a gramophone played a slow waltz, the sound soft as breath behind closed curtains. St. Mary Mead had folded itself into evening, but the piece felt as brittle as spun sugar. When she reached her gate, a figure detached itself from the shadows. It was Mrs. Clement, shawl pulled tight, her face troubled. "You were at the bakery, weren't you?" "The inspector stopped here a few minutes ago. He's certain now it was no accident." Miss Marple unlocked her door. Ah, certainty. Such a flattering condition. Won't you come in and allow it to cool over? A cup of tea? Inside, lamplight gilded the sitting room, catching on the porcelain and the small framed samplers that read, "Virtue is its own reward, and cleanliness is next to godliness." The vicar's wife looked around as if the room itself offered sanctuary from the moral draught outside. Miss Marple poured the tea, her manner unhurried, as though scandal were merely another visitor to be offered a saucer and a scone. "Crail means to question the boy again," Mrs. Clement said. "He's found ink stains on a ledger in the bakery Billy's handwriting. A shopping list, but written on the back of a torn letter." Miss Marple passed her the sugar tongs. "People often reuse paper. Thrift disguises more things than extravagance ever could. You don't think he is guilty?" "I think guilt is a garment seldom made in one size," Miss Marple said. "It fits more than one person before it wears out." The fire cracked softly. Outside, the wind had risen, brushing through the privet like whispering skirts. Mrs. Clement hesitated, then leaned forward. "My husband's worried, Jane. He says the Edgecombes are on the verge of ruin. If this scandal continues, they'll lose the bakery. But there's something more. He mentioned that Mr. Edgecombe once had a partner years ago, before they came here." Miss Marple looked up. "A partner?" "Yes. A man named Faber. Hungarian, I believe." There was talk of a disagreement, though the records vanished when the man went abroad. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her fingers paused. "Ah, abroad. Such a useful word. It covers everything from travel to exile." A faint knock interrupted them. It was Mr. Clement, tall and courteous, carrying a sheaf of parish notices. "Inspector Crail still about," he said gravely. "He asked if you'd observed anything unusual near the old vicarage. Someone's seen light there again." "Indeed I have," Miss Marple replied. "It is curious, is it not, how the unused often refuses to remain so." He smiled faintly. "You think someone's taken shelter there?" "Possibly. Or perhaps something has been stored where memory is least likely to wander." Mrs. Clement shivered. "The place gives me the creeps. It's been locked since Mr. Halford died." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Death locks very little, my dear. It only changes the key." When the Clements had gone, she sat for a long while, gazing at the fire. Flames curved inward like petals folding over their own glow. The note, the wax paper, the foreign floral's separate ingredients, each tasteless alone, yet together capable of ferment. She thought of Mrs. Edgecombe's fierce respectability, of Mr. Edgecombe's uneasy silence, of Billy's restless fear. Each seemed caught in some moral dough, rising beneath unseen heat. A rap on the window startled her. Billy stood outside, cap in hand, pale in the lamplight. She opened the door. "You shouldn't be out so late, dear. Villagers dream too loudly after dark." He stepped in, twisting his cap. "I didn't know. Where else to go, Miss Marple? They'll say I did it. But I swear I didn't put any note in the dough." "Then you mustn't swear," she said gently, leading him toward the hearth. "Only tell me what you remember." "It was that foreign flour, miss, the one with the strange label. I used it for one batch, the one with the tea cakes. Mr. Edgecombe said not to mention it, said it might be bad for trade." Miss Marple poured him tea, steady as a ritual. "People often mean different things by trade, my dear. Some mean livelihood, others mean transactions. A third sort means deceit." Billy shook his head helplessly. "There was something else he told me to burn the paper sack straight away. Said the print was cursed. That's when I saw her Mrs. Edgecombe standing by the bins, tearing something small like a letter." Miss Marple watched the firelight flicker on his face, and yet she said she never saw a note until it emerged from the oven. "She lies, miss. She's lying to save him. Or to save herself," Miss Marple murmured. It is sometimes difficult to tell the difference. Billy's eyes glistened. What'll happen to me? Perhaps nothing at all if you remain steady, she said. Truth, like yeast, works slowly. It cannot be rushed without spoiling. A gust rattled the window. Miss Marple rose to draw the curtains, her reflection briefly superimposed upon the dark outside. For an instant, she thought she saw movement again at the old vicarage, this time unmistakable, the faint yellow blink of a candle at an upstairs window. She turned back to Billy. Go home by the lane behind the post office. Keep to the light, and remember, flour shows every footprint. Choose where you walk. When the door closed behind him, she stood in the hush that followed. The village had never seemed so awake within its sleep. Outside, the wind carried the scent of baking sweet, thick and faintly bitter, like a memory turning over in its pan. Miss Marple folded her hands, eyes upon the fire. The problem, she murmured, is not who wrote the note, it's who was meant to read it. The thought hung in Miss Marple's sitting room like the last note of a hymn, unresolved and expectant. She stood by the drawn curtains, the candle's reflection wavering on the glass. Outside, the light at the old vicarage guttered, then vanished entirely, as though aware of being observed. The wind pressed against the panes once, twice, and then fell into an uneasy quiet. By morning, that quiet had deepened into dread. The bakery's shutters remained closed long past opening time, and by 9:30, Mrs. Price Ridley had declared it a sure sign of guilt. A small crowd gathered by the green, drawn as much by boredom as concern. Gossip fluttered like washing on a windy day, uneven, entangled, and impossible to fold away neatly. Inspector Crale's motor car arrived soon after. He stepped out briskly, every inch the man expecting to be proved right. Miss Marple, standing discreetly by the post office wall, watched him cross to the bakery with the reluctant air of one walking into a confession not his own. Moments later, the door opened under his knock. It was Mrs. Edgecombe, who appeared pale, composed, her apron starched into virtue. "My husband's not here," she said before Crale could speak. "He went out early, said he had deliveries to make. I don't know where." Crale looked over her shoulder into the dim shop. "And the boy?" "Gone too. Left a note for me on the counter. Said he couldn't stay where he wasn't trusted." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "That was very sudden." Mrs. Edgecombe turned sharply. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there." "Yes, sudden and ungrateful. My husband took him in out of pity." "Pity," Miss Marple said softly. "Such a dangerous form of generosity." Crale stepped inside. "We'll take a look, if you don't mind." He gestured toward the counter where a scrap of paper lay beneath the till. It was a torn page from a delivery ledger, written hastily in blue-black ink. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of it to happen." Mrs. Edgecombe pressed a hand to her mouth. "He's run off to save his own skin. That's what it means. Or someone else's," said Miss Marple quietly. Crale glanced at her but said nothing. He ordered the constable to search the sheds and yard, then moved into the bakehouse. The oven stood cold, and the air carried a faint metallic scent, like scorched sugar and smoke. A cracked cup lay overturned beside the sink, its handle cleanly snapped, as though by sudden pressure. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it. "Things do break," she murmured, "especially when one tries too hard to keep hold of them." From the alley came the constable's shout. They followed him outside, where the refuse bin stood half open. Inside lay Mr. Edgecombe's delivery cap, its brim scorched at one edge, and beneath it a folded paper sack, the same foreign make as before. Crale unfolded it carefully, revealing the faint outline of handwriting reversed in ink, a repetition of the same phrase as the note baked into the tea cake. "I cannot live with it any longer." The crowd gasped. Mrs. Edgecombe swayed and clutched the doorway. "He's done something dreadful," she whispered. My husband's gone too, I don't know where." Miss Marple's voice was calm but low. "Sometimes people run from discovery. Other times they run to confess where they will be believed." Crail barked orders to his men to comb the lanes toward Much Benham. The motor car sped off, leaving the air heavy with exhaust and speculation. Miss Marple remained by the green, her eyes fixed not on the road, but on the sky above the church tower, pale, cloudless, and faintly trembling with heat. A day too bright for tragedy, which in her experience was precisely when tragedy preferred to appear. At noon, word came from the mill road of a bicycle found abandoned near the canal bridge. Its chain snapped, the same boy's satchel beside it. Inside were 2 loaves, a letter addressed to Mrs. E., and a fountain pen missing its nib. No sign of Billy. The village divided instantly. Half believed the boy had fled in shame. The other half whispered he had met with something worse. Miss Marple, walking slowly home through the murmuring lanes, noted how quickly morality adjusted itself to each possibility: forgiveness for the dead, condemnation for the living. She stopped by the old vicarage gate. It stood slightly ajar, though the weeds beyond were untrampled. A single envelope lay in the grass, damp from the morning dew. The handwriting was elegant, foreign, and precise. She turned it over and read the imprint of a name barely legible beneath the smudge, Faber & Sons, Vienna. She slipped it into her pocket, her mind quietly rearranging what she knew not yet solving, but sifting, like flour catching the finer grains of truth. She thought of the foreign sack, the Hungarian label, and the quarrel long ago. The web had begun to tighten, though not yet visibly. As she reached the lane by the church, Mrs. Clement hurried toward her, breathless. "Jane, you've heard. They've pulled someone from the canal by the bridge." Miss Marple's hand tightened on her basket. "Alive?" "They're not certain. They think it's Mr. Edgecombe." The wind carried the church bell's single note across the water meadows, soft and hollow as an unanswered call. Miss Marple turned toward the sound, her face composed but distant, like a woman watching a curtain fall before she's ready to see the ending. The crowd at the canal bridge had gathered in respectful silence, though silence in St. Mary Mead never stayed uninhabited for long. Murmurs wove through the hedgerows, thin, trembling lines of speculation disguised as sympathy. Miss Marple arrived without haste, her presence folding gently into the throng like a stitch closing a seam. The constable lifted his cap when he saw her, uncertain whether to shield her or invite her nearer. Inspector Crail stood by the embankment, sleeves rolled, his boots darkened by wet grass. "We've got him, Miss Marple," he said, grim but steady. "The baker. Not long gone by the look of him. No note, no struggle marks. Looks like a drowning, plain and simple." "Plain," Miss Marple murmured, "is such a comforting word, Inspector, though comfort often misleads more than deceit." Crail frowned, but she was already watching the water. The canal moved with that slow, indifferent grace peculiar to English waterways, concealing much, revealing nothing. The body lay beneath a tarpaulin now, a shape too human to be dismissed, too final to be pitied in words. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Death, she always thought, did not end the scandal. It only made it respectable. She looked toward the bridge's far side, where a bicycle lay half in the reeds. "The boy's bicycle?" she asked. Crail nodded. "No trace of him yet. Could have run before this happened. Or after," she said gently. "Flight is often a shadow's. Instinct, not its cause." He glanced at her, uneasy. "You think the lad's mixed up in the man's death?" "I think confusion loves company," she said, "and guilt attracts it." A small splash drew her eye. A loaf of bread, swollen and pale, drifted near the bank. The paper wrapping clung faintly to it, the ink of a printed label dissolving into the current. Crail gestured to a constable, who fished it out. "From the bakery," he said. Part of his delivery, maybe. Miss Marple's expression deepened to thought. Bread and water. There's a sort of poetry to it, don't you think? As though he'd taken communion from his own guilt. By midday, the body had been taken to the vicarage hall for examination. The villagers, sated with horror, trickled home to their kitchens where gossip could be served with tea. Miss Marple lingered at the church gate, where Mrs. Clement met her with red-rimmed eyes. "It's too dreadful," she said. "Poor Mrs. Edgecombe, what must she be suffering?" "Suffering and pretending not to," Miss Marple said softly. "It's one of the oldest forms of endurance." Mrs. Clement hesitated. "You don't think she does?" "I think her courage is of the domestic sort," Miss Marple replied. "She will scrub and bake until remorse looks like good housekeeping." She returned home as the afternoon light cooled into silver. The envelope she'd found near the old vicarage lay on her writing desk, beside a small dish of dried lavender. She studied it again at Faber & Sons, Vienna. The handwriting was not recent. The ink had the faded smoothness of years. She unfolded the paper inside a receipt for a shipment of confectioner's molds and inks. The date, she noted, preceded the Edgecombe's arrival in St. Mary, Mead by nearly a decade. Her eyes moved to the window. Across the lane, Mrs. Edgecombe's curtains were drawn, though smoke curled from her chimney. That small contradiction concealment paired with domestic performance always drew Miss Marple's interest. She reached for her shawl and hat. The time, she felt, had come for a visit. The baker's widow received her with stiff courtesy. "I don't know what you expect to find here, Miss Marple," she said. "I've told everything I know." "I expect nothing," Miss Marple said gently. "I simply thought companionship might be a comfort." Mrs. Edgecombe hesitated, then motioned her inside. The shop smelled faintly of damp flour and carbolic. On the table lay a tray of biscuits, unevenly baked, as though the act of making them had mattered more than the result. "I keep busy," the woman said. "It stops one thinking." But it seldom stops the truth from thinking of us," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Edgecombe looked up sharply. "You mean my husband? Everyone will say he did it now, wrote those awful notes, took his life to escape disgrace." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but shame and guilt are not always the same thing. One may kill from either." The woman's hands tightened on the tray. "He wasn't wicked, Miss Marple, only frightened. There were debts, old ones. He said they followed him like ghosts. And the boy?" A pause. "He meant no harm, but he knew things he shouldn't. My husband said he was getting letters. I never saw them. Letters with foreign stamps, perhaps." Mrs. Edgecombe's eyes flickered. The smallest betrayal. "I don't remember." Miss Marple rose slowly. "Of course. Memory is the politest form of self-defense." She crossed to the counter where a tin of sugar lay half open. On the surface, someone had drawn absent circles with a fingertip, small, repetitive, almost meditative. At the edge of one, a dark smudge gleamed faintly blue. She replaced the lid and turned, her expression as mild as before. "I dare say you'll sleep better tonight," she said kindly. Grief is exhausting work. After she had gone, she stood for a long while in the twilight, her thoughts tracing slow, deliberate lines. The pattern was beginning to emerge, a network of old business, quiet threats, and one desperate act of concealment. But still one thread remained loose, the thread that tied the dead man's fear to the boy's disappearance. When the first stars appeared above the vicarage spire, Miss Marple's eyes moved toward the dark windows of the old vicarage once more. A faint sound reached her across the lane, not wind this time, but the unmistakable creak of a door opening where no one lived. She did not move, only listened to a quiet watcher of patterns too fragile yet to touch. The faint creak of the unseen door seemed to stretch the night itself. Miss Marple's head tilted slightly, listening. Then, gathering her shawl closer, She crossed the lane with the noiseless step of one who had been slipping through secrets for years. The air was cool and damp. The weeds brushed her skirts like hesitant hands. She paused beneath the broken gate of the old vicarage. Its garden, once kept in pious order, lay tangled under moonlight nettles, roses, and the faint scent of lavender fighting for dominion. A window above glimmered, not bright, but enough to mark presence. She tapped at the door lightly. No reply. The latch yielded at her touch. Inside, the hallway smelled of mildew and paper, the scent of rooms left to time. Her candle's beam wavered across faded hymnals stacked in a crooked pile, and something else, a plate and cup used recently. She advanced toward the parlor, and in the doorway stood Billy, eyes wide, his hands trembling around a candle stub. "Miss Marple." "I didn't." He broke off, afraid of chasing his breath. "Then you'd best not finish that sentence, dear," she said calmly. "Better to begin another. You've chosen a curious place to spend the night." "I couldn't stay with them watching me," he muttered. "The inspector, Mrs. Edgecombe, they all think I did it." "You mean Mr. Edgecombe's death?" Billy nodded, his throat working. "I swear I didn't hurt him. I found him by the bridge. He was already looking away. I ran. I knew how it'd look." She stepped forward, setting the candle on a shelf. Its flame made his face appear both older and younger, as if guilt and innocence were taking turns to borrow his features. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said softly. "I went to the mill road early, before sunrise. I wanted to post something. The letter from Mrs. Edgecombe, the one she said was none of my business. I thought it might prove she was lying. I took it from the drawer last night." He swallowed hard. "But when I got there, he was lying by the bank. I panicked. I dropped the letter somewhere near the bridge." Miss Marple's gaze deepened, serene, but intent. "You're certain it was a letter from her?" "Yes, miss. Had her writing on it tidy, upright, like she talks." She considered this. "Then tell me, my dear, why was the envelope found by the vicarage gate addressed not to her, but to a firm in Vienna?" His mouth fell open. "Vienna? I just saw her name." "The eye often obeys fear, not fact," she said gently. "Sit down." He obeyed. The candle light trembled, brushing gold against his thin hair. It wasn't meant for her, then? But why would she? People keep old envelopes, Billy. They find them useful for hiding what does not belong to them, and those who hide are often not the ones who wrote what's hidden. He looked at her helplessly. "I thought maybe it was Mr. Edgecombe. He was scared of something. Said he couldn't pay anymore." Miss Marple's knitting bag rested against her wrist like a small, patient witness. "Ah, money again. It always returns to the scene of a moral crime." She crossed to the writing desk where his candle had been burning earlier. The surface bore faint indentations, the ghost of letters written atop another sheet. She ran her fingers lightly over them, then reached for a page of thin paper nearby. "A pencil, if you please," she said. He found one. She shaded the page carefully, and slowly a few words emerged from the pressure marks below. "Payment due by the 15th. Faber and Sons, shipment withheld." Miss Marple's brows rose a fraction. So the dead man's ghosts were not imaginary. Debts, perhaps debts of import and deceit. Billy leaned forward. "You think he was blackmailed?" "Or threatened," she said. "The line between the two is like the crust on a pie, delicate and easily cracked." Before either could speak again, footsteps sounded in the hall. A silhouette appeared tall, candle in hand, its light catching on a familiar brooch, Mrs. Edgecombe's, the silver leaf she always wore pinned beneath her collar. Her face in the doorway was as white as the flower she lived among. "I knew you'd come here," she said hoarsely. "You've always meddled, Miss Marple." "My dear," Miss Marple said, perfectly composed. Meddling is such an uncharitable word for curiosity born of concern. Mrs. Edgecombe's gaze darted to Billy. "You told her. You've ruined everything." "I didn't," he cried. "I only wanted the truth." "The truth," she said bitterly, "is what people decide it is after you're gone." She stepped into the room, a candle shaking in her hand. "My husband was weak. He brought it on himself, those foreign orders, the debts, the lies. He made me part of it. Do you think I could live with that?" Then the note Billy began. "Wasn't mine," she snapped. "It was his. But I read it, and I knew what it meant." Miss Marple's tone was quiet. "And what did it mean, Mrs. Edgecombe?" The woman's shoulders sagged, that he'd rather drown than see his name dragged through the mud. Silence settled. Only the ticking of a forgotten clock broke it, faint and precise. Miss Marple studied her. "A noble version of events," she said softly. "Perhaps too noble." Mrs. Edgecombe's chin lifted. "You can think what you please. I've nothing more to say." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed, my dear, words are unnecessary when one's conscience already speaks so loudly." When she left the old vicarage moments later, the night had thickened to a velvet dark. Behind her, a single window still burned with candlelight, then dimmed. She walked slowly homeward, the cool air biting at her cheeks. Her mind, however, was not at rest. The woman's tremor, the boy's fear, the foreign ink, they formed a pattern still too neat to trust. At her gate, she paused. A figure waited there, shadowed beneath the elm. The shape moved forward into the lamplight Inspector Crail. "I've been looking for you," he said. "There's been another discovery." Miss Marple's eyes, serene yet wary, met his. "Another?" He nodded grimly. "A second note hidden in the baker's ledger, and this time it has a name." The inspector's words hung between them like the chill in the autumn air. Miss Marple stood very still beneath the elm, her shawl lifting faintly in the breeze. "A name, you say?" she asked at last, her voice soft, but with that quiet precision that always seemed to arrange facts, even as she spoke them. Crail nodded, producing a folded sheet from his pocket. "Found in the back of the bakery ledger, pasted under the last page. The handwriting matches the first note, as far as our man can tell." He opened it under the lamplight. The ink had bled slightly, as though damp hands had once held it too tightly. The message was brief. "I cannot live with it any longer. Faber must be paid. Tell her I have tried." "Faber," Miss Marple murmured. "So he did exist, and apparently still exerts influence from afar." Crail frowned. "We checked the foreign correspondence, but there's no record of any payments or debts, unless they kept them off the books." "Debts of money, perhaps not," Miss Marple said quietly. "But there are other currencies, pride, loyalty, affection. One cannot balance those with ledgers." They began to walk toward the vicarage, the road gleaming faintly with the night's dampness. Crail was silent for some distance before saying, "You think the wife knew? Or the boy?" "I think everyone knew a fragment," Miss Marple said. "The difficulty is that fragments never agree about where they belong. Much like villagers with a scandal." Crail managed a rueful smile. "You do enjoy teasing me with riddles." "Oh, no," she said mildly. "Life teases us both. I merely translate." They reached the vicarage hall, now dimly lit by a single lamp where the constable kept watch over the dead man's possessions. Miss Marple paused by the trestle table where the bakery's ledger lay open beside the note. Its pages bore the tidy columns of ordinary commerce flour, yeast deliveries until the final one, where a faint smudge of ink had been half erased, then written over again. Under her fingertip, she traced the indentation of a previous line, faint but legible in the slant of light. "Paid in full to H.E.," she murmured. "Hardly Faber." nor Edgecombe, for that matter. His wife then? Crail asked. Miss Marple shook her head. No woman signs her own initials on her husband's concealments. It's a man's flourish, defensive and deliberate. Someone who wanted to suggest honesty while hiding something else. Crail rubbed his jaw. You're suggesting the note wasn't written by the dead man? Perhaps only the first one was, she said. The rest, well, imitation is an art often born of necessity. He looked puzzled. Why forge a confession? To make guilt look tidy, Inspector. We English are very fond of neatness, especially in sin. From the doorway came a soft voice. Mrs. Clement stood there, her hands clasped in agitation. Oh, Miss Marple, thank goodness you're here. Mrs. Edgecombe is in the vicarage kitchen. She came to see her husband and said she couldn't bear the wait. She's quite distraught. Distraught, Miss Marple repeated gently. That word covers so much ground. Let's go to her. They found Mrs. Edgecombe seated at the scrubbed table, her face blotched from crying, her apron still on, as if she'd fled her shop mid-task. The sight of Miss Marple seemed to steady her a little. She grasped her hand. I didn't know what else to do. I wanted to tell the inspector, but it felt disloyal. To the truth? Miss Marple asked softly. To my husband, she whispered. He was a good man once. Before the letters started. Before the money disappeared. Crail took a seat opposite. These letters from Faber. She nodded miserably. They came every few months, demanding payment for a shipment long ago. But the goods were never ours to sell. They belonged to someone else. My husband thought it would be forgotten after we moved here. Then one came with a threat that if he didn't pay, the police would learn of the fraud. He couldn't bear that. Miss Marple's expression remained mild, though her eyes were all right with quiet comprehension. So he borrowed, perhaps, from another, and that person too began to press. I don't know, she said brokenly. He wouldn't tell me everything, but he grew so nervous, so pale. And then those notes began appearing. I thought at first he was writing them as a warning to himself, a sort of prayer. But the last one. She stopped, pressing a hand to her lips. I didn't write it, Miss Marple. Truly, I didn't. No, Miss Marple said gently. But you recognize the hand. Her silence confirmed it. Crail leaned forward. Whose was it? Mrs. Edgecombe hesitated, tears bright in her eyes. Billy's, she whispered. The boy copied my husband's ledgers. He said it was to learn the trade, but I think he copied more than that. The handwriting, the phrases. He meant no harm at first, but he knew about the letters. He saw what was happening and thought to frighten my husband into confessing. Crail swore softly. So the lad was behind the first note? Miss Marple shook her head. No, Inspector. The first note was genuine. The second was mimicry. Perhaps even meant as comfort, a strange, childish attempt to make remorse seem shared. Mrs. Edgecombe looked bewildered. Then why would he run away? Because imitation can become an accusation once the original is gone, Miss Marple said. And fear travels faster than innocence. The clock struck midnight. The sound rolled through the hall, solemn as a benediction. Mrs. Edgecombe sobbed quietly. Crail rose, muttering about sending men to the next village. Miss Marple remained seated, her gaze distant. Inspector, she said softly, you'll find the boy not far. Guilt doesn't wander aimlessly. It returns to where it began. I suggest you look near the bakery. Some lights never quite go out, even when we think we've extinguished them. Crail hesitated. And you, Miss Marple? I, she said, shall wait for dawn. Morning air clears more than the conscience. Her eyes drifted toward the window. Outside, the first suggestion of pale light touched the mist. In it, she imagined a figure moving between shop fronts, small, weary, and burdened not by crime, but by the terrible weight of good intentions gone astray. The pale outline Miss Marple had imagined proved real enough. By dawn's first thinning of mist, the constable's whistle echoed from the green, and soon half the village had roused to hear that Billy had been found asleep in the bakery doorway, shivering under a flour sack, half-starved and weeping. Word ran through St. Mary Mead with the speed peculiar to forgiveness once the danger had passed. Miss Marple, standing beside Inspector Crail as the boy was led toward the station, noted that the relief in Mrs. Edgecombe's face bore the nervous brightness of reprieve, not gratitude. "He looks more frightened of home than of prison," she murmured. Crail's expression was grim. "We'll have the truth from him soon enough. He claims he went back to fetch something, perhaps whatever Faber wanted paid." "He's a poor liar," Miss Marple said. "But poor liars often tell the truth by accident." Crail grunted and strode off, leaving her at the shop door. She waited until the last of the onlookers drifted away. Mrs. Price Ridley huffing that sentimental weakness was ruining law and order, and Mrs. Hartnell insisting that boys of that age always mean well, which is far worse. Then Miss Marple entered the bakery. Inside, dawn's pale light caught on the trays, gleaming over the tidy disorder of resumed work. Mrs. Edgecombe stood at the counter, sleeves rolled, face drained of expression. She was kneading bread with the slow, mechanical devotion of one repeating a prayer whose meaning has long been forgotten. "You're open early," Miss Marple said. "There's no sense shutting up shop," Mrs. Edgecombe replied without looking up. "Life doesn't stop because people die." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It merely changes who keeps the accounts." The woman flinched, a faint tremor passing through her hands. "You think I should have let it all go? My husband's good name, the business, the boy's lies." "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that names are seldom as good as we believe, and lies are rarely so deliberate. Did you ever ask your husband what he owed that Faber firm for?" Mrs. Edgecombe hesitated, then shook her head. "He said it was a trade debt. I believed him, I suppose I wanted to." "And yet," Miss Marple went on, "he was not a dishonest man, merely one accustomed to small shortcuts that seem harmless until the sum of them becomes moral bankruptcy. He ordered cheap imported inks to mix into confectionery glaze, didn't he? Harmless enough until they made people ill." The woman's eyes widened. "How did you do?" "Because, my dear, only a baker would fear the police over colored sugar, and only a wife would destroy evidence of something she half understood but could not endure seeing proved." Mrs. Edgecombe's hands froze in the dough. "He said it was safe. He said everyone did it." Just to make the sweets brighter, Miss Marple's voice was soft, compassionate. "Brightness, like decency, is a dangerous thing when it comes from the wrong source." Tears welled silently. The letter from Faber threatened to expose it unless he paid. "I found it that morning. I thought he'd gone to reason with them, not to—" She broke off, pressing her palms over her eyes. "I didn't mean for the boy to be caught in it. You sent him to post a letter, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked quietly, not realizing it was the same one you'd taken from your husband's drawer, the last of his correspondence with Faber. When the boy vanished, you assumed he'd destroyed it, or worse. Mrs. Edgecombe nodded, choking on her breath. "I burned everything after. I thought if the letters were gone, it would end." Miss Marple touched her arm. "One cannot bake away guilt, Mrs. Edgecombe. It rises whether we will or not." The door opened and Crail entered, hat in hand. "We've got our story," he said. "The boy's clear. He took a letter but never sent it out of fear. The man fell by accident and slipped by the bridge, perhaps chasing him. The coroner will be satisfied." "Convenient," Miss Marple said, though truth seldom fits as neatly as convenience. Crail's mouth tightened. "It's as close to tidy as we'll get." Then, "You're fortunate," she replied, "for I've always found tidiness deceptive. It hides crumbs beneath the cloth." He sighed. Meaning, she said. "You might recheck the ink stains on those notes. You'll find the handwriting on the second and third is not quite the same as the first. Mrs. Edgecombe's hand trembles upward on the G, her husband's slanted downward. You'll see she tried to imitate his distress, to make his suicide seem deliberate rather than accidental. She wanted mercy from a village that forgives tragedy sooner than disgrace. Mrs. Edgecombe's cry was soft, despairing. He fell, I swear, but they'd have said it was my doing. I wrote the others so they'd stop whispering. Miss Marple's tone was kind but unyielding. Yes, my dear, you tried to save his honor by inventing his guilt. That is the saddest arithmetic of all. Crail stood very still. There's enough compassion in this to fill a sermon, he said at last, but I don't see crime in it. Nor will the law, Miss Marple said. And that, perhaps, is justice's mercy when pity and wrongdoing meet halfway. The inspector gave a curt nod, then turned and left without another word. The door's bell rang once, faintly, like an absolution. Miss Marple stayed while Mrs. Edgecombe washed her hands at the sink, movement slow, deliberate. When the woman turned, her face was calmer, the exhaustion of confession already setting in. Will people ever stop talking, Miss Marple? Eventually, Miss Marple said. Scandal has a short memory once it has found a new object, and the vicar's sermon on repentance will do the rest. Mrs. Edgecombe gave a broken laugh. You think kindly of us, even when we don't deserve it. Oh, I think accurately, Miss Marple replied. Deserving seldom enters into kindness. Outside, the village was returning to its routines. The postmistress polished her window, the milkman's whistle floated down the lane and in the distance. Children's voices carried from the green where someone had dared to laugh again. The sun, pale but determined, pushed through the clouds as though even heaven had decided to resume its duties. Miss Marple walked slowly home, her shoes clicking lightly on the damp stones. She paused at her garden gate, where the scent of early roses mingled with the faintest trace of yeast from the bakery across the way. In that mingling of sweetness and sour, she felt the essence of human life, its perpetual mixture of innocence, vanity, and remorse. She removed her gloves, folding them neatly as the church bell struck 8. Poor Mrs. Edgecombe, she murmured. She wished to preserve appearances and succeeded, though not in the way she hoped. A robin hopped along her hedge, cocking its head as if to agree. She smiled faintly. Still, the village will mend. It always does. There's comfort in that, though not much wisdom. Inside, the kettle began to sing. Miss Marple set it upon the tray with quiet satisfaction. Another tragedy had been, smoothed into the domestic order of St. Mary Mead, at least on the surface. Beneath it, as always, human nature continued its slow, steady rising, much like dough left overnight. And when the first knock came at her door, gentle, uncertain, carrying the sound of apology, she was neither surprised nor unprepared. She merely looked toward it and said very softly, "Come in, my dear. I've been expecting you."